from Daksh Creative, and welcome to another exciting tutorial inside of Photoshop. It's been a while since I made this tutorial and I thought the timing is perfect. I got some free time, so I finally got myself to sit down and build this for you all. Okay, so we've got a lot of ground to cover, and this is the picture we're going to be working with. To give you a little background on this image, I would also like to give credit to the amazing talented photographer that I've been working with of late. His name is Dilip Abraham. I will leave a link to his Instagram account on the description below, and also the stylist Michelle. I will leave the link to her Instagram profile down below as well in the description. Okay, so let's take a look at this picture and analyze it. So the first thing is we see that it's a very busy shot. So we started off wanting to shoot at UB City, which is a popular location inside of Bangalore. And well, as you can see, it's a pretty crowded place, and this particular shot was taken on a Sunday evening where there were a lot of people walking around and doing their own thing. You can see that these two guys are trying to click pictures of each other. There's a group here, and this guy's probably wondering what the hell is going on around him. And there's something interesting going on here, but let's not even get there. Okay, so right off the bat, it is very clear that this is an absolutely busy shot. Now, how do we take this image and make it Instagram ready? Make it something that looks like this. Okay, so this is what we are going to be trying to achieve in this tutorial. This is the kind of look we're going to try and achieve. You can see that there is a lot of things going around here. There is like this nice bokeh effect and also a slight motion blur to showcase motion, to create or rather to simulate the effect of the camera panning along with the subject. Okay, so we're going to take a look at how we can simulate the same results here. All right, now the first thing we're going to do is I'm going to create a copy of my basic layer, my background layer, and I'm going to hide it. Now this is very important because you don't want to ruin the original image. So whatever you're doing on top of it, and then if you want to make changes, you can always get the original image back. Okay, now the next thing I'm going to do is draw out a layer mask to separate the subject, or in this case the foreground element, from the background. Okay, now the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to use my pen tool to separate out the subject. Let's grab my trusty pen tool. Now I'm not going to get too much into detail on how we can use the pen tool, but then I'm sure there's a lot of learning material out there that best describes how to use the pen tool and create a awesome layer mask. Now again, for the benefit of this tutorial, I'm going to be doing a very rough job um, extracting our subject here. However, depending on the image that you're working on, you may choose to spend a little time and um, cut this out uh, nice and accurately. Okay, so as you can see here, I have gone ahead and created a layer mask around my subject, which essentially separates the person here. And I really like using the pen tool as much as I can. There are different ways to extract the foreground element from the background. Okay, now that the foreground is separated from the background, I'm going to go ahead and create a new copy of this layer and then unhide it. Okay, now while I'm at this, I'm also going to hide my foreground element. Okay, now you're not gonna see any difference here. So I'm hiding my foreground element, my basically my layer mask, and then I'm unhiding a copy of the image. Now I'm gonna choose, or rather click on this layer mask here and then hold Control on the keyboard, Control or Command if you're using a Mac, and then click on the layer mask. So it's going to create a nice selection around our subject. I'm going to go into our background layer, and then I'm going to go into Edit and Fill. Now in our fill window, I'm going to say content aware. So if your drop down says anything else, please ensure that you click on the drop down and then choose content aware. This is very important. So what Photoshop does here is it takes the color and the texture from the background image or from the area around the selection and then fills it in to remove the subject as accurately as possible. And you click on OK. Okay, so you can immediately see that Photoshop has done a pretty good job of removing our subject from the image. Okay, now there is some vignetting or kind of like a border around our uh, model here, but then we're not going to be worrying about it too much because we're going to be mostly blurring this out, so this is not even going to be visible. Now, while I'm at this, I'm also going to quickly grab my patch tool and remove this little piece of I don't know what that is, looks more like a vent. I'm going to just remove that from the ground. Okay, now that we've done that, let me go ahead and unhide my subject. Okay, and with my background layer selected, I'm going to name it background so that it's kind of easier, and then I'm going to name this foreground. Okay, I'm going to select my background layer, and the first thing I'm going to do is right click and convert to smart object. Now, smart objects are powerful in a way where it's very easy for us to add a filter and then make changes to it in future. Now, a lot of people do not really understand the versatility of a smart object. Usually when you select a layer, go into filter and apply any of these filters here, you are baking it onto the layer itself. However, when you have a smart object and then go into a filter and apply any of these filters, you have the option of changing the settings even after the effect is applied. All right. Now, this is going to be a little memory intensive because Photoshop is going to have to render these filters on the fly every time you make changes to the image because it's not baked into the layer. But then it's going to really help us in case of any changes to the settings or the values of the filter in future. So I'm going to go into blur, or rather blur gallery to start with, and I'm going to choose tilt shift. Now tilt shift is going to really help us create that nice bokeh effect in the background. That's something that you would usually achieve using a high-end DSLR. Okay, now I'm gonna go ahead and move my focus point somewhere really down. Let me kind of pull this down a little more. You can already see that Photoshop is kind of struggling, like so. Okay, I'm gonna bring this guy down. Mm, bring this guy down as well. And move this a little bit. Okay, now when you're working on a shot like this, it's important to understand where your subject's feet touches the ground. So if your subject is going to be perfectly in focus, then the plane that your subject is walking on is also going to be perfectly in focus. Okay, and that's exactly what we've done here, and I'm pretty happy with the results so far. We can also play around with the blur value, and I know that a blur value of around 20 works best for this effect. So I'm going to say 20, and I'm going to hit enter. So depending on the image that you're using, feel free to experiment with the values here and try and get the effect that's most desirable for you. And then I'm going to click OK. And this is going to take a little while for Photoshop to apply the rendering, or rather the rendered. Gosh, what's wrong with me today? Okay, it's going to take Photoshop a little while to apply the rendered effect onto the image. There you go. Okay, now that we have this, let's go ahead and apply another filter. Now, something else that you would have noticed is I also had applied a little bit of motion blur to create this illusion of camera panning along with the subject here as he is walking. So to do that, I'm going to select my background layer once again, go back into filter, and this time I'm going to go to blur, motion blur. Okay, let's zoom out a little. And well, a value of 50 works for me. How do I know that? Because I've done this before. But then depending on the image that you're using, you could go ahead and experiment with this value. Now again, the amount of effect that you're going to add depends on the speed that you would like to showcase. Now, This is a human being walking, and obviously you're not gonna really crank up the value here because then it's gonna look really, really funny. But then if you are using, let's say, like a motorbike or a car that you want to show perfectly in frame and then the background's all blurry, you could go ahead and use a higher value to kind of bring out that speed. However, for us, for the purpose of this tutorial, a value of 50 works just fine, or I might even want to crank this up a little more, or maybe just around 60. And once you're happy with the results, you can go ahead and click OK. Okay, that's going to apply the effect onto our image. I'm not really going to be worried about this portion right now because it's mostly going to be cropped out um, for uh, for an Instagram kind of an aspect ratio. So I'm just going to leave that as it is. Okay, now the picture looks pretty fine as of now, right? So you can already see that it's kind of coming together like our original image here. Okay, so to this, there is a little problem here. If I zoom into the shot, you will realize that there is a little bit of noise on our foreground. However, since we applied the blur effect, the background looks perfectly clean, right? So all the noise, all the tiny little dots here have been perfectly smeared across the frame so that you don't see any noise at all. Now, how do we fix this? In order to do that, I'm going to go back into filter with my background layer selected. I'm going to go back into filter, and this time I'm going to say noise and add noise. Okay, now I know for a fact that a value of 7.65 works for me. However, depending on the amount of noise on your image, you might want to add or remove a little bit of noise. Ensure that you don't go way off because then you're going to get something like this and then your foreground's going to look different, or you're going to get something way less noisy and then your foreground's going to look more noisy, which again is not very realistic as well. So it's really a matter of experimenting and understanding how much noise you have on your image. And if you don't have monochromatic checked, click on monochromatic because this is monochromatic noise. You don't see the red and green uh, dots on our subject here. So I'm going to say monochromatic and I'm going to click on OK. There you go. So now we have a perfectly in focus foreground element against a background which has a very good bokeh and a slight amount of motion blur applied to it. At this point, since I'm happy with the results, I'm going to select my background layer, right click and say, well, not there, sorry. I'm going to select my background layer, right click and say rasterize layer. Now this essentially bakes in all the filters so that Photoshop does not have to reapply or re-render these filters over and over again. Now this may also be a good time for us to crop the image into the aspect ratio that we want and also recompose it. So I'm going to hit the C key on my keyboard, or alternately I can come here and select the crop tool. I'm going to come here and choose 1:1 because that's what I need for this particular image, and position the image appropriately. I do see that there's a lot of space above the head, so I might want to bring this down a little bit. And oops, there you go, like so. And also move or reposition our subject to fall within the rule of thirds. I in fact want to move him a little more. Perfect. I'm really happy with this composition. Once done, just click on the tick sign or hit enter on your keyboard and you should be left with a cropped image ready for Instagram. Okay. Now, one last thing that I want to do to this image while we are at it is actually two things. One is I would like to sharpen this image a little bit so that the details around the edges stand out a little better, and the fact that we've used the pen tool to cut them out doesn't look way too obvious. So I'm gonna go ahead and create a new layer, and I'm gonna call this layer focus. Okay, now I'm gonna go into filter, or rather I'm gonna go into image, apply image. I'm gonna leave the settings to the defaults and click on OK. Okay, this basically combines all of the layers underneath and pastes it on top into the selected layer. Now to this layer, I'm gonna go ahead and change the blend mode to hard light. Alright, please don't panic, there's still work here. I'm gonna now go into filter, other, and use a high pass filter. Now let's choose a value where we can see very good definition around here that kind of makes the image look nice and sharp. So that's way too much, it's way too less, somewhere like so. Click on OK when you're happy with the results. Now you can see that it immediately adds a little bit of sharpening to our image, so everything looks a little more in focus. And now off to color correction. I'm going to go ahead and add a black and white adjustment layer and kind of move the yellows a little bit and maybe a little bit of red. There's red on your skin tone. And I'm going to have to also reduce the opacity because I really don't want this to be a perfectly black and white picture. So I'm going to reduce the opacity to about 40%. And to this I'm going to add a curves adjustment and create a slight contrast curve. While I'm at it, I might also want to increase the reds a little bit, just a little, and bring the blue down a little bit to create that slight sense of warmth to my image. Okay, with that done, we're pretty much good to go. So I'm going to select these layers and group them. And you can see that this is our original image and this is the edited one. Original image, edited. Original, edited. Okay, so we went straight from a busy, crowded picture all the way into something that's absolutely Instagram worthy in about minutes. Okay, so that's the power of Photoshop, people. So until the next time I see you all, peace.